Page 58. Mom and Dad enrolled us in the Mary S. Black Elementary School, a long, low building with an asphalt playground that turned gooey in the hot sun. My second grade class was filled with the children of miners and gamblers, scabby-kneed and dusty from playing in the desert, with uneven, home-scissored bangs. Our teacher, Miss Page, was a small, pinched woman, given to sudden rages and savage thrashings with her ruler. Mom and Dad had already taught me nearly everything Miss Page was teaching the class. Since I wanted the other kids to like me, I didn't raise my hand all the time, the way I did in Blythe. Dad accused me of coasting. Sometimes he made me do my arithmetic homework in binary numbers because he said I needed to be challenged. Before class, I'd have to recopy it into Arabic numbers. But one day I didn't have time, so I turned in the assignment in its binary version. "What's this?" Miss Page asked. She pressed her lips together as she studied the circles and lines that covered my paper, then looked up at me suspiciously. "Is this a joke?" I tried to explain to her about binary numbers and how they were the system that computers used, and how Dad said they were far superior to other numeric systems. Miss Page stared at me. "It wasn't the assignment," she said impatiently. "She made me stay late and redo the homework." I didn't tell Dad because I knew he'd come to school to debate Miss Page about the virtues of various numeric systems. Lots of other kids lived in our neighborhood, which was known as the Tracks. And after school, we all played together. We played red light, green light, tag, football, Red Rover, or nameless games that involved running hard, keeping up with the pack, and not crying if you fell down. All the families who lived around the tracks were tight on cash. Some were tighter than others, but all of us kids were scrawny and sunburned and wore faded shorts and raggedy shirts and sneakers with holes, or no shoes at all. What was most important to us was who ran the fastest and whose daddy wasn't a wimp. My dad was not only not a wimp, he came out to play with the gang, running alongside us, tossing us up in the air, and wrestling against the entire pack without getting hurt. Kids from the tracks came knocking at the door, and when I answered, they asked, "Can your dad come out and play?" Lori, Brian, and I, and even Maureen, could go pretty much anywhere and do just about anything we wanted. Mom believed that children shouldn't be burdened with a lot of rules and restrictions. Dad whipped us with his belt, but never out of anger, and only if we backtalked or disobeyed a direct order, which was rare. The only rule was that we had to come home when the street lights went on. "And use your common sense," Mom said. She felt it was good for kids to do what they wanted because they learned a lot from their mistakes. Mom was not one of those fussy mothers who got upset when you came home dirty or played in the mud or fell and cut yourself. She said people should get things like that out of their systems when they were young. Once an old nail ripped my thigh while I was climbing over a fence at my friend Carla's house. Carla's mother thought I should go to the hospital for stitches and a tetanus shot. "Nothing but a minor flesh wound," Mom declared after studying the deep gash. "People these days run to the hospital every time they skin their knees," she added. "We're becoming a nation of sissies." And with that, she sent me back out to play. Some of the rocks I found while I was exploring out in the desert were so beautiful that I could not bear the idea of leaving them there. So I started a collection. Brian helped me with it, and together we found garnets and granite and obsidian and Mexican crazy lace and more turquoise. Dad made necklaces for Mom out of all that turquoise. We discovered large sheets of mica that you could pound into powder and then rub all over your body so you'd shimmer under the Nevada sun as if you were coated with diamonds. Lots of times, Brian and I thought we'd found gold, and we'd stagger home with an entire bucket full of sparkling nuggets. But it was always iron pyrite, fool's gold. Some of it Dad said we should keep because it was especially good quality for fool's gold. My favorite rocks to find were geodes, which Mom said came from the volcanoes that had erupted to form the Tuscarora Mountains millions of years ago during the Miocene period. From the outside, geodes looked like boring round rocks, but when you broke them open with a chisel and hammer, the insides were hollow like a cave, and the walls were covered with glittering white quartz crystals or sparkling purple amethysts. I kept my rock collection behind the house, next to Mom's piano, which was getting a little weathered. Lori and Brian and I would use the rocks to decorate the graves of our pets that had died, or of the dead animals we found and decided should get a proper burial. I also held rock sales. I didn't have that many customers because I charged hundreds of dollars for a piece of flint. In fact, the only person who ever bought one of my rocks was Dad. He came out behind the house one day with a pocket full of change and was startled when he saw the price tags I'd taped to each rock. "Honey, your inventory might move a little faster if you dropped your prices," he said. I explained that all my rocks were incredibly valuable and I'd rather keep them than sell them for less than they were worth. Dad gave me his crooked smile. Sounds like you've thought this through pretty well, he said. He told me he had his heart set on buying a particular piece of rose quartz, but didn't have the $600 I was charging. So I cut the price to $500 and let him have it on credit. Brian and I loved to go to the dump. We looked for treasures among the discarded stoves and refrigerators, the broken furniture and stacks of bald tires. We chased after the desert rats that lived in the wrecked cars, or caught tadpoles and frogs in the scum-topped pond. Buzzards circled overhead, and the air was filled with dragonflies the size of small birds. There were no trees to speak of in Battle Mountain, but one corner of the dump had huge piles of railroad ties and rotting lumber that were great for climbing and carving your initials on. We called it the woods. Toxic and hazardous waste were stored in another corner of the dump, where you could find old batteries, oil drums, paint cans, and bottles with skulls and crossbones. Brian and I decided some of this stuff would make for a neat scientific experiment. So we filled up a couple of boxes with different bottles and jars and took them to an abandoned shed we named our laboratory. At first, we mixed things together, hoping they would explode, but nothing happened. So I decided we should conduct an experiment to see if any of the stuff was flammable. The next day after school, we came back to the laboratory with a box of Dad's matches. We unscrewed the lids of some of the jars, and I dropped in matches, but still nothing happened. So we mixed up a batch of what Brian called nuclear fuel, pouring different liquids into a can. When I tossed in the match, a cone of flame shot up with a whoosh, like a jet afterburner. Brian and I were knocked to our feet. When we stood up, one of the walls was on fire. I yelled to Brian that we had to get out of there, but he was throwing sand at the fire, saying that we had to put it out or we'd get in trouble. The flames were spreading toward the door, eating up that dry, old wood in no time. I kicked out a board in the back wall and squeezed through. When Brian didn't follow, I ran up the street calling for help. I saw Dad walking home from work. We ran back to the shack. Dad kicked in more of the wall and pulled Brian out coughing. I thought Dad would be furious, but he wasn't. He was sort of quiet. We stood on the street watching the flames devour the shack. Dad had an arm around each of us. He said it was an incredible coincidence that he happened to be walking by. Then he pointed to the top of the fire, where the snapping yellow flames dissolved into an invisible, shimmery heat that made the desert beyond seem to waver, like a mirage. Dad told us that zone was known in physics as the boundary between turbulence and order. It's a place where no rules apply, or at least they haven't figured them out yet, he said. Y'all got a little too close to it today. None of us kids got allowances. When we wanted money, we walked along the roadside picking up beer cans and bottles that we redeemed for 2 cents each. Brian and I also collected scrap metal that we sold to the junk dealer for a penny a pound, 3 cents a pound for copper. After we redeemed the bottles or sold the scrap metal, we walked in town to the drugstore next door to the Owl Club. There were so many rows and rows of delicious candies to choose from that we'd spend an hour trying to decide how to spend the 10 cents we'd each made. We'd pick a piece of candy, and then as we got ready to pay for it, change our minds and pick up another piece, until the man who owned the store got mad and told us to stop fingering all his candy and make a purchase and get out. Brian's favorite was the giant sweet tart candies, which he licked until his tongue was so raw it bled. I loved chocolate, but it was gone too quickly, so I usually got a sugar daddy, which lasted practically half the day and always had a funny poem printed in pink letters on the stick, like, "To keep your feet from falling asleep, wear loud socks. They can't be beat." On our way back from the candy store, Brian and I liked to spy on the Green Lantern, a big dark green house with a sagging porch right near the highway. Mom said it was a cat house, but I never saw any cats there. Only women, wearing bathing suits or short dresses who sat or lay out on the porch, waving at the cars that drove by. There were Christmas lights over the door all year round, and Mom said that was how you could tell it was a cat house. Cars would stop in front, and men would get out and duck inside. They couldn't figure out what went on at the Green Lantern, and Mom refused to discuss it. She would say only that bad things happened there, which made the Green Lantern a place of irresistible mystery to us. Brian and I would hide behind the sagebrush across the highway, trying to peer inside the front door when someone went in or out, but we could never see what was going on. A couple of times we sneaked up close and tried to look in the windows, but they were painted black. Once, a woman on the porch saw us in the brush and waved to us, and we ran away shrieking. One day, when Brian and I were hiding in the sagebrush, spying, I double dared him to go talk to the woman lying out on the porch. Brian was almost 6 by then, a year younger than me, and wasn't afraid of anything. He hitched up his pants, handed me his half-eaten sweet tart for safekeeping, walked across the street, and went right up to the woman. She had long black hair, her eyes were outlined with black mascara thick as tar, and she wore a short blue dress printed with black flowers. She had been lying on her side on the porch floor, her head propped up on one arm, but when Brian walked up to her, she rolled over on her stomach and rested her chin on her hand. From my hiding place, I could see that Brian was talking with her, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. Then she reached out a hand to Brian. I held my breath to see what this woman who did bad things inside the Green Lantern was going to do to him. She put her hand on his head and ruffled his hair. Grown-up women always did that to Brian because his hair was red and he had freckles. It annoyed him. He usually swatted their hands away, but not this time. Instead, he stayed and talked with the woman for a while. When he came back across the highway, he didn't look scared at all. What happened? I asked. Nothing much, Brian said. What'd you talk about? I asked her what goes on inside the Green Lantern, he said. Really? I was impressed. What did she say? Nothing much, he said. She told me that men came in, and the women there were nice to them. Oh, I said. Anything else? Nah, Brian said. He started kicking at the dirt like he didn't want to talk about it anymore. She was kind of nice, he said. After that, Brian waved to the women on the porch of the Green Lantern, and they smiled real big and waved back, but I was still a little afraid of them. Our house in Battle Mountain was filled with animals. They came and went, stray dogs and cats, their puppies and kittens, non-poisonous snakes and lizards and tortoises we caught in the desert. A coyote that seemed pretty tame lived with us for a while, and once Dad brought home a wounded buzzard that we named Buster. He was the ugliest pet we'd ever owned. Whenever we fed Buster scraps of meat, he turned his head sideways and stared at us out of an angry-looking yellow eye. Then he'd scream and frantically flap his good wing. I was secretly glad when his hurt wing healed and he flew away. Every time we saw buzzards circling overhead, Dad would say that he recognized Buster among them and that he was coming back to thank us. But I knew Buster would never even consider returning. That buzzard didn't have an ounce of gratitude in him. We couldn't afford pet food, so the animals had to eat our leftovers, and there usually wasn't much. If they don't like it, they can leave, said Mom. Just because they live here doesn't mean I'm going to wait on them hand and foot. Mom told us that we were actually doing the animals a favor by not allowing them to become dependent on us. That way, if we ever had to leave, they'd be able to get by on their own. Mom liked to encourage self-sufficiency in all living creatures. Mom also believed in letting nature take its course. She refused to kill the flies that always filled the house. She said they were nature's food for the birds and lizards, and the birds and lizards were food for the cats. Kill the flies, and you starve the cats, she said. Letting the flies live, in her view, was the same as buying cat food, only cheaper. One day I was visiting my friend Carla when I noticed that her house didn't have any flies. I asked her mother why. She pointed toward a shiny gold contraption dangling from the ceiling, which she proudly identified as a Shell no-pest strip. She said it could be bought at any gas station and that her family had one in every room. The no-pest strips, she explained, released a poison that killed all the flies. Well, what do your lizards eat? I asked. We don't have any lizards either, she said. I went home and told Mom we needed to get a no-pest strip like Carla's family, but she refused. If it kills the flies, she said, it can't be very good for us. Dad bought a souped-up old Ford Fairlane that winter, and one weekend when the weather got cold, he announced that we were going swimming at the Hot Pot. The Hot Pot was a natural sulfur spring in the desert north of town, surrounded by craggy rocks and quicksand. The water was warm to the touch and smelled like rotten eggs. It was so full of minerals that rough, chalky encrustations had built up along the edges, like a coral reef. Dad was always saying we should buy the Hot Pot and develop it as a spa. The deeper you went into the water, the hotter it got. It was very deep in the middle. Some people around Battle Mountain said the Hot Pot had no bottom at all, that it went clean through to the center of the earth. A couple of drunks and wild teenagers had drowned there, and people at the Owl Club said when their bodies floated back to the surface, they'd been literally boiled. Both Brian and Lori knew how to swim, but I had never learned. Large bodies of water scared me. They seemed unnatural, oddities in the desert towns where we'd lived. We had once stayed at a motel with a swimming pool, and I worked up enough nerve to make my way around the entire length of the pool, clinging to the side. But the hot pot didn't have any neat edges like that swimming pool. There was nothing to cling to. I waded in up to my shoulders. The water around my chest was warm, and the rocks I was standing on felt so hot I wanted to keep moving. I looked back at Dad, who watched me, unsmiling. I tried to push out into deeper water, but something held me back. Dad dived in and splashed his way toward me. "You're going to learn to swim today," he said. He put an arm around me, and we started across the water. Dad was dragging me. I felt terrified and clutched his neck so tightly that his skin turned white. "There, that wasn't so bad, was it?" Dad asked when we got to the other side. We started back, and this time, when we got to the middle, Dad pried my fingers from around his neck and pushed me away. My arms flailed around, and I sank into the hot, smelly water. I instinctively breathed in. Water surged into my nose and mouth and down my throat. My lungs burned. My eyes were open, the sulfur stinging them, but the water was dark and my hair was wrapped around my face and I couldn't see anything. A pair of hands grabbed me around the waist. Dad pulled me into the shallow water. I was spitting and coughing and breathing in uneven, choking gasps. "That's okay," Dad said. "Catch your breath." When I recovered, Dad picked me up and heaved me back into the middle of the hot pot. "Sink or swim," he called out. For the second time, I sank. The water once more filled my nose and lungs. I kicked and flailed and thrashed my way to the surface, gasping for air, and reached out to Dad. But he pulled back, and I didn't feel his hands around me until I'd sunk one more time. He did it again and again, until the realization that he was rescuing me only to throw me back into the water took hold. And so, rather than reaching for Dad's hands, I tried to get away from them. I kicked at him and pushed away through the water with my arms. And finally, I was able to propel myself beyond his grasp. "You're doing it, baby," Dad shouted. "You're swimming." I staggered out of the water and sat on the calcified rocks, my chest heaving. Dad came out of the water too and tried to hug me, but I wouldn't have anything to do with him, or with Mom, who'd been floating on her back as if nothing were happening, or with Brian and Lori, who gathered around and were congratulating me. Dad kept telling me that he loved me, that he never would have let me drown. But you can't cling to the side your whole life. That one lesson every parent needs to teach a child is, if you don't want to sink, you better figure out how to swim. What other reason, he asked, would possibly make him do this? Once I got my breath back, I figured he must be right. There was no other way to explain it.